The security badge beeped red 3 times before I realized they'd already deactivated it. I stood there like an idiot, holding my coffee and laptop bag, watching my former colleagues walk past me into biotech innovations without making eye contact. 4 years of 18-hour days, 3 major breakthrough patents, and a revolutionary glucose monitoring device that was about to make them billions. And now I couldn't even get through the front door to clean out my desk. Victoria Sterling had been thorough. The email was still glowing on my phone screen, sent at 11:47 p.m. the night before. Effective immediately. Your research position has been restructured. Please report to facilities management tomorrow morning for your new assignment. New assignment. That's corporate speak for demotion to janitor after your life's work gets handed to someone else. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Hi, I'm Maya Rodriguez. I'm 31 now, and that morning, at the locked door happened exactly 9 months ago. What I didn't know then was that Victoria Sterling had just made the biggest mistake of her career. What started as the most humiliating day of my professional life became the catalyst for building something that would completely reshape the medical device industry. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to where this really began, because understanding how I got to that locked door is the only way you'll truly appreciate where this story ends. 4 years earlier, I was a 26-year-old biomedical engineer fresh out of UT Austin with a PhD in spectroscopic analysis and a burning obsession with solving one of diabetes management's biggest problems. Every diabetic I knew, including my younger brother Carlos, had to prick their fingers multiple times daily to check blood glucose levels. The strips were expensive, the process was painful, and worst of all, people would skip tests because of the inconvenience, leading to dangerous health complications. I knew there had to be a better way, something that could measure glucose levels accurately, without breaking the skin, without strips, without any of the barriers that kept people from monitoring their health properly. When Jake Morrison first interviewed me for Biotech Innovations, the company was basically 6 people working out of a converted warehouse in East Austin. The air conditioning barely worked, the coffee maker was perpetually broken, and Jake's desk was a folding table. He'd bought at Target, but he had vision. During our interview, he pulled out a sketch he'd been working on, a rough concept for a non-invasive glucose monitor. "Everyone says it's impossible," he told me, his eyes lighting up with that startup founder intensity. "The technology isn't there yet. The accuracy isn't reliable. The form factor would be too bulky. But what if we could crack it? What if we could make diabetes management as simple as checking your watch?" I looked at his sketch and saw exactly what he was seeing. This wasn't just a product opportunity. It was a chance to genuinely improve millions of lives. "When do I start?" I asked. Those first 2 years were the hardest and most rewarding of my career. I was essentially building a research lab from scratch while simultaneously trying to solve a problem that had stumped much larger companies with vastly superior resources. My workspace was a corner of the warehouse where I'd set up optical benches, spectroscopy equipment, and prototyping stations that I'd mostly assembled myself from components I found on eBay and surplus electronics sites. Jake gave me complete creative freedom and a budget that was laughably small, but somehow always managed to stretch far enough to get what I needed. I lived on energy drinks and determination, often sleeping on the small couch in our break area when I was in the middle of critical testing phases that couldn't be interrupted. The breakthrough came at 2:30 in the morning on a Tuesday in March during my second year. I'd been working on a novel approach using near-infrared spectroscopy combined with machine learning algorithms to identify glucose concentrations in interstitial fluid without requiring any blood samples. Every previous attempt had failed because of interference from other biological compounds, inconsistent readings, or form factors that were completely impractical for daily use. But that night, something clicked. The prototype I'd been testing suddenly started producing readings that were consistently within 3% of traditional fingerstick measurements. I ran the same test 47 times in a row, and every single reading was accurate. I actually started crying right there in the lab, surrounded by optical equipment and circuit boards, because I knew I'd just solved a problem that could help my brother and millions of people like him. Jake was the first person I called, even though it was nearly 3 in the morning. He answered on the second ring, and when I told him what had happened, he was at the lab within 20 minutes, still wearing pajama pants and flip-flops. We spent the next 6 hours running every test we could think of, confirming that the results were real and reproducible. By the time the rest of the team arrived that morning, Jake and I had already started sketching out patent applications and discussing timeline for developing a market-ready device. That day marked the beginning of what would become Gluco Watch, a wearable device roughly the size of a large fitness tracker that could monitor blood glucose levels continuously throughout the day, with accuracy that rivaled traditional blood testing methods. Over the next 18 months, I refined the technology, miniaturized the components, and developed manufacturing processes that would allow us to produce the devices at scale. I worked with industrial designers to create something that people would actually want to wear, collaborated with software developers to build companion apps that would help users track patterns and share data with their healthcare providers, and conducted extensive testing to ensure the device would work reliably across different skin types, ages, and environmental conditions. The patent applications I filed during this period covered not just the core spectroscopic analysis method, but also the machine learning algorithms, the optical sensor design, the user interface innovations, and the manufacturing techniques we'd developed. Every aspect of Gluco Watch was protected by intellectual property that I had personally conceived, developed, and documented. By the time we were ready to seek Series A funding, Biotech Innovations had grown to 15 employees, and we'd moved into a proper office space in a tech park near downtown Austin. The Gluco Watch prototypes we were demonstrating to investors were sleek, accurate, and ready for FDA approval processes. Jake and I had proven that non-invasive glucose monitoring wasn't just possible, it was practical and scalable. The investor meetings went better than we'd dared to hope. Within 3 months, we'd closed a $12 million funding round led by Austin Ventures, with additional investment from several prominent angel investors who had experience in medical device commercialization. The funding changed everything, just not in the ways I'd expected. Suddenly, we had a board of directors, formal reporting structures, and pressure to professionalize our operations in ways that would satisfy institutional investors. Jake was still CEO, but he now had to answer to board members who had strong opinions about everything from hiring strategies to product development timelines. The most significant change was the board's insistence that we needed experienced medical device industry leadership to guide us through FDA approval and commercial launch processes. They wanted someone with a proven track record of bringing complex medical technologies to market, someone who understood regulatory requirements and had relationships with healthcare systems and insurance companies. That's how Victoria Sterling entered our world. Her resume was undeniably impressive. MBA from Wharton, 15 years at major pharmaceutical companies including Medtronic and Abbott, direct experience with FDA approval processes, and a track record of successful product launches that had generated hundreds of millions in revenue. She interviewed beautifully, speaking knowledgeably about regulatory pathways, reimbursement strategies, and market positioning approaches that I'd never even considered. When the board offered her the position of Chief Technology Officer, Jake consulted with me about the decision. "What do you think?" he asked during one of our regular coffee walks around the neighborhood. "She definitely knows things we don't know," I admitted. "And if she can help us get Gluco Watch to market faster and more successfully, that's what matters most." Victoria's first day was a carefully orchestrated introduction to the entire team. She wore a tailored navy blazer and spoke with the kind of confident authority that comes from years of corporate success. "I'm incredibly excited to join this innovative team," she announced during our all-hands meeting. Maya's breakthrough work on GlucoWatch represents exactly the kind of transformative technology that can reshape an entire industry. My role here is to help translate that innovation into market success, ensuring that Maya's incredible invention reaches the patients who need it most. I remember feeling genuinely optimistic about the collaboration. Here was someone who understood the business side of medical device development, who could handle the regulatory complexities and commercial challenges that were completely outside my expertise. I could focus on continuing to refine the technology while she navigated the institutional requirements for bringing it to market. The changes started subtly. Victoria instituted weekly technology review meetings where I would present my ongoing development work to a broader team that now included several new hires she'd brought in from her previous companies. These sessions were framed as collaborative, opportunities to ensure that all stakeholders understood the technical progress and could provide input on commercial viability. Initially, I appreciated having more perspectives on my work, especially from people who understood manufacturing, scalability, and regulatory requirements better than I did. But gradually, I noticed that these meetings were becoming less about collaboration and more about Victoria explaining my own technology back to me using different terminology and framing it within broader strategic contexts that somehow minimized my role in creating it. The most concerning change was Victoria's decision to bring in additional technical staff to support my work. She hired Brad Chen, a biomedical engineer with experience at larger medical device companies, ostensibly to help with FDA documentation and manufacturing transition processes. Brad was competent and pleasant enough, but I quickly realized that Victoria was positioning him not as my assistant, but as a peer contributor to GlucoWatch development. In meetings, she would refer to our technical team and discuss how Brad and Maya are collaborating on optimization strategies, even though Brad's contributions were largely limited to documenting work I'd already completed and suggesting modifications based on approaches he'd seen at previous companies. What bothered me most was how Victoria had begun presenting GlucoWatch's development history. In investor updates and board presentations, she would describe the technology as having been preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Developed by our technical team under my leadership, with my specific contributions mentioned only as part of a broader collaborative effort. The revolutionary spectroscopic analysis method that I'd spent 2 years perfecting became our proprietary sensing technology. The machine learning algorithms that I'd developed and trained became our advanced data processing capabilities. Even the industrial design elements that I'd worked on extensively with outside consultants became our user-centered design approach. I was being systematically erased from my own invention's origin story. The situation became more serious when Victoria announced that she wanted to optimize our patent portfolio by consolidating overlapping applications and ensuring that our intellectual property strategy aligned with commercial objectives. She brought in a law firm that specialized in medical device patents, ostensibly to strengthen our filings and improve our defensive position against potential competitors. What actually happened was that several of my original patent applications were modified to list Victoria as a co-inventor, with Brad added as a contributor on applications related to manufacturing and user interface elements. When I questioned these changes, Victoria explained that patent law required all significant contributors to be properly credited, and that my original applications had been too narrowly focused on technical implementation rather than broader, commercial applications. "Maya, you're absolutely the core inventor here," she assured me during a private meeting in her office. "No one is trying to diminish your contributions, but for our patents to be as strong as possible, we need to ensure that all aspects of the innovation are properly documented and attributed. This isn't about taking credit away from you. It's about building the strongest possible intellectual property position for the company." I wanted to believe her, but something felt fundamentally wrong about the process. The patents being modified were covering innovations I'd developed entirely on my own, often before Brad had even joined the company. Having Victoria and Brad listed as co-inventors on my work felt like a misrepresentation of historical fact, regardless of whatever commercial logic might justify it. Despite my growing concerns about credit and recognition, I remained focused on the technology itself. GlucoWatch was approaching readiness for clinical trials, and I was passionate about ensuring that every aspect of the device would perform flawlessly in real-world testing environments. I continued working the same 18-hour days I'd always worked, refining calibration algorithms, optimizing sensor sensitivity, and conducting extensive reliability testing. The device we were preparing for FDA submission was genuinely revolutionary, capable of providing continuous glucose monitoring with accuracy levels that exceeded anything else available in the market. I knew that once GlucoWatch reached patients, it would transform diabetes management in ways that would improve millions of lives. The clinical trial results exceeded even my most optimistic projections. GlucoWatch demonstrated 99.7% accuracy compared to traditional fingerstick testing across diverse patient populations with no significant adverse effects and extremely high patient satisfaction scores. Users reported that the device was comfortable to wear continuously, easy to use, and provided valuable insights into how their diet, exercise, and medication affected their glucose levels throughout the day. Healthcare providers were enthusiastic about the continuous monitoring capabilities and the detailed data that patients could share during appointments. The FDA indicated that our submission was progressing smoothly through their review process, and preliminary discussions with insurance companies suggested that reimbursement approval would be straightforward, given the device's clear clinical benefits and cost-effectiveness compared to traditional monitoring methods. Jake was ecstatic about the trial results and the FDA progress. During our regular coffee meetings, he would talk excitedly about the manufacturing partnerships Victoria was negotiating and the distribution agreements being finalized with major pharmacy chains. "Maya, we're actually going to do this," he would say, shaking his head in amazement. "GlucoWatch is going to be in pharmacies within 18 months. Diabetics are going to be able to walk into any CVS or Walgreens and buy a device that will completely change how they manage their condition. And it's all because of what you built." I felt incredibly proud and grateful to be part of something that would have such a meaningful impact on people's lives. Then came the morning that changed everything. I arrived at the office to find Victoria waiting for me with Jake and two people I didn't recognize who turned out to be from our board of directors. "Maya, we need to discuss some important developments regarding GlucoWatch commercialization," Victoria began, gesturing for me to sit down in the conference room. "The FDA approval process is moving forward successfully, and we're preparing for manufacturing scale-up and market launch. As part of that transition, we've been evaluating our organizational structure to ensure that we have the right leadership in place for the next phase of company growth." What came next was a carefully rehearsed explanation of how my role was being restructured to better align with the company's evolving needs. Victoria explained that while my technical contributions had been invaluable during the research and development phase, the company now needed different types of expertise. To successfully commercialize GlucoWatch, Brad would be promoted to lead technology officer, with responsibility for overseeing manufacturing transition, regulatory compliance, and ongoing product development. I would be transitioning to a senior research associate position, focusing on next-generation technology development and supporting manufacturing troubleshooting as needed. The demotion was presented as a strategic decision that would allow me to focus on what I did best, while ensuring that GlucoWatch commercialization would be managed by someone with direct experience in medical device manufacturing and regulatory processes. "Maya, your innovative thinking and technical expertise are absolutely crucial to our long-term success," Victoria emphasized. "This restructuring isn't about diminishing your role, It's about positioning everyone to contribute most effectively during this critical transition period. Brad's background in manufacturing scale-up and regulatory affairs makes him the right person to lead the technology team through commercialization, while your creative problem-solving abilities will be essential for developing our next generation of products. I listened to this explanation in stunned silence, trying to process what was actually happening. The technology I'd spent 4 years developing, the patents I'd conceived and filed, the breakthrough innovations that had made GlucoWatch possible were all being transferred to someone who had contributed primarily documentation and manufacturing recommendations. Brad was a competent engineer, but he had no deep understanding of the spectroscopic analysis methods that made GlucoWatch work, no familiarity with the machine learning algorithms that enabled accurate glucose detection, and no experience with the optical sensor designs that allowed the device to function reliably across different users and environmental conditions. He was being put in charge of technology he couldn't have invented and probably couldn't independently replicate. "I understand this is a significant change," Jake said, speaking directly to me for the first time during the meeting. "Maya, you know how much I value your work and your contributions to this company. This decision isn't about your capabilities or your performance. It's about ensuring that we have the right organizational structure for the challenges ahead." I looked at Jake, someone I'd considered not just a colleague but a friend, someone who had seen me work 18-hour days for years to solve problems that everyone said were impossible. He couldn't meet my eyes. He was going along with Victoria's restructuring because the board had told him to, because investors wanted experienced medical device leadership, because my technical expertise was less valued than Brad's corporate pedigree and Victoria's pharmaceutical industry connections. The meeting ended with logistics about my transition to the new role, including a reduction in salary that reflected my changed responsibilities and an office relocation to a smaller space in a different part of the building. I was told that I would be supporting Brad during the manufacturing transition process by documenting technical specifications and troubleshooting any issues that arose during scale-up. Victoria emphasized that my institutional knowledge would be invaluable during this process and that the company was committed to ensuring that my expertise continued to contribute to GlucoWatch's success. I nodded and agreed to everything they proposed because I was too shocked to formulate any meaningful response. I walked out of that conference room feeling like I'd just been erased from my own life's work. The worst part wasn't even the demotion itself. It was how quickly everyone adapted to the new organizational structure, as if nothing significant had changed. Brad moved into the office that had been mine, began leading the technology team meetings I'd previously run, and started representing the company's technical capabilities in investor presentations and FDA communications. Victoria sent an email to the entire company announcing the restructuring and explaining how these changes would strengthen our commercialization capabilities. My 4 years of breakthrough research and development were summarized as having established a strong technical foundation that will now be scaled for market success under Brad's experienced leadership. Within a week, I realized that my new role was essentially that of a highly educated technician. I was asked to document technical specifications that I'd already documented multiple times, create troubleshooting guides for manufacturing processes I'd developed, and provide support for problems that occurred when Brad or his team tried to replicate work I'd been doing routinely for years. The creative problem-solving and innovative research that had defined my career at biotech were completely eliminated from my responsibilities. I was being used as an institutional memory resource while being systematically excluded from any decisions about the technology's future development or commercial implementation. The most humiliating moment came 3 weeks after my demotion when Brad scheduled a meeting with me to discuss knowledge transfer protocols. He sat across from me in what used to be my office, surrounded by my research notes and prototypes, asking me to explain the fundamental principles behind spectroscopic glucose detection, as if he were learning about it for the first time. Which, in many ways, he was. Brad had experience with traditional blood glucose monitoring systems and regulatory documentation, but the revolutionary non-invasive technology that made GlucoWatch possible was completely outside his expertise. Yet here he was, newly appointed as lead technology officer, asking me to teach him how my own invention worked. "Maya, I really appreciate you taking the time to walk me through this," Brad said, leaning forward with his notebook open and pen ready. "Victoria wants to ensure we have comprehensive documentation of all technical processes before we begin manufacturing scale-up. I know this might seem redundant since you developed most of these systems, but having everything formally documented will be crucial for FDA compliance and quality control procedures." I watched him take notes on concepts I'd been working with for 4 years, writing down explanations of algorithms I'd developed through months of trial and error, sketching diagrams of optical sensor configurations that had taken me countless iterations to perfect. What made the situation even more surreal was how Brad would occasionally interrupt my explanations to suggest modifications based on approaches he'd seen at previous companies. "Have you considered using a different wavelength range for the infrared analysis?" he would ask, referring to a fundamental design decision I'd made after extensive testing and optimization. At Medicore, we found that slightly longer wavelengths sometimes provided better tissue penetration. I would patiently explain why I'd chosen the specific wavelength ranges used in GlucoWatch, detailing the months of experimentation that had led to these choices and the performance data that validated their effectiveness. Brad would nod thoughtfully and make additional notes, as if he were evaluating the merit of my technical decisions, rather than trying to understand them. The knowledge transfer sessions continued for weeks, covering every aspect of GlucoWatch technology from the basic spectroscopic principles to the complex machine learning algorithms that processed raw optical data into accurate glucose readings. I found myself documenting not just the final implementations, but also the development history, explaining why certain approaches had been abandoned and how I'd overcome specific technical challenges. Brad was methodical about recording everything, creating comprehensive technical manuals that would theoretically allow anyone with appropriate background to understand and replicate the technology. What disturbed me was realizing that these documentation sessions weren't primarily about ensuring continuity or improving manufacturing processes. They were about transferring my expertise to Brad so completely that my continued involvement would become unnecessary. Victoria made this objective clear during one of our increasingly infrequent one-on-one meetings. "Maya, the documentation. Work you've been doing with Brad is exactly what we need to position the company for sustainable growth," she told me, reviewing notes on her tablet while we sat in her office. "Your deep technical knowledge is invaluable, but we need to ensure that knowledge is accessible to the broader team and not dependent on any single individual. That's just good business practice for a company that's preparing for major commercial expansion." The irony wasn't lost on me. The technology that was making this commercial expansion possible had been entirely dependent on my individual expertise for 4 years, but now that it was ready to generate revenue, that dependency was being viewed as a business risk that needed to be eliminated. The documentation process also revealed how thoroughly Victoria had been restructuring the narrative around GlucoWatch's development. The technical manuals that Brad was creating, based on my explanations but written in his voice, positioned him as the primary technical authority on the technology. My role in developing the core innovations was described in passive voice and historical context, as if I were a former consultant who had contributed to early research phases. The spectroscopic analysis methodology was initially developed during preliminary research phases, one section read, and has been refined and optimized for manufacturing implementation under current technical leadership. 4 years of my life's work was being reduced to preliminary research phases that had required refinement and optimization by people who hadn't understood it 6 months earlier. Even more troubling was how Victoria began excluding me from meetings and decisions that directly affected my former projects. Technical review sessions that I'd previously led were now conducted by Brad, with my input requested only when specific questions arose about implementation details. Investor presentations about GlucoWatch's technical capabilities were delivered by Victoria and Brad, with my contributions limited to preparing supporting materials and answering detailed technical questions if they arose during Q&A sessions. I was becoming increasingly invisible within my own company. My expertise valued only as a resource to be consulted when problems occurred, but not as leadership to be included in strategic planning. The exclusion became more systematic when Victoria implemented new project management procedures that she claimed would improve efficiency and accountability. All technical development work was now tracked through software systems that required approval hierarchies for any significant changes or experiments. My access permissions in these systems were configured to allow me to view project status and submit requests, but not to initiate new research directions or modify existing development priorities. Brad's account had full administrative access, allowing him to approve or reject any work I wanted to pursue. I was effectively reduced to being a contractor within my own research team, able to work on problems only when specifically assigned and required to justify any exploratory research through formal proposal processes. This new structure became particularly frustrating when manufacturing partners began encountering technical issues during scale-up processes. The prototype GlucoWatch devices that I'd built by hand in our lab had been optimized for performance rather than mass production, and transitioning to automated manufacturing required solving engineering challenges that hadn't been apparent during small-scale development. Optical sensors needed to be calibrated differently when assembled by machines rather than by hand. Machine learning algorithms required adjustment to account for slight variations in component specifications that occurred during volume production. Software interfaces needed modification to work reliably across different hardware configurations that would be used by contract manufacturers. These were exactly the kinds of technical problems I'd been solving for years, requiring deep understanding of both the underlying science and the practical engineering considerations that affected real-world performance. But under the new organizational structure, I could only work on these issues when Brad specifically assigned them to me, and my proposed solutions had to be approved through formal review processes before implementation. What had previously been rapid iterative problem-solving became bureaucratic procedures that slowed development and often resulted in suboptimal solutions, because the people making approval decisions didn't have sufficient technical depth to evaluate different approaches effectively. The situation reached a breaking point when a critical calibration issue threatened to delay FDA approval by several months. Contract manufacturers were reporting that GlucoWatch devices produced on their assembly lines showed accuracy variations that exceeded acceptable tolerances, despite following specifications that had worked perfectly for hand-assembled prototypes. Brad spent weeks working with manufacturing engineers to identify the source of the problem, implementing various adjustments that failed to resolve the underlying issue. Victoria was becoming increasingly frustrated with the delays, especially since investors and board members were pressuring her to maintain the original commercialization timeline. I knew exactly what was causing the calibration problems, because I'd encountered similar issues during early prototype development. The optical sensors used in GlucoWatch required precise alignment between LED light sources and photodetectors, with tolerance levels measured in micrometers. Hand assembly allowed for real-time adjustment and optimization of these alignments, but automated assembly equipment couldn't replicate the subtle calibration procedures I'd developed through trial and error. The solution required modifying both the sensor design to accommodate manufacturing tolerances and the calibration algorithms to compensate for alignment variations that would be inevitable during volume production. When I submitted a detailed proposal explaining the problem and outlining specific technical solutions, Brad initially dismissed my recommendations as unnecessarily complex. He preferred approaches that required minimal changes to existing manufacturing processes, even though these simpler solutions wouldn't adequately address the underlying calibration issues. Victoria supported Brad's preference for manufacturing-friendly modifications, arguing that extensive design changes would introduce additional regulatory risks and delay market launch even further. They were prioritizing speed and convenience over technical effectiveness, despite the fact that inadequate solutions would likely result in much more significant delays and potentially compromise the device's market viability. After 2 more weeks of failed attempts to resolve the calibration issues using Brad's preferred approaches, Victoria finally authorized implementation of my proposed solutions. The modifications I'd recommended worked exactly as predicted, resolving the manufacturing tolerance problems and enabling contract manufacturers to produce GlucoWatch devices that met all performance specifications. But even this success was reframed in ways that minimized my contributions. Victoria's update to investors described how our technical team successfully addressed manufacturing challenges through collaborative problem-solving and innovative engineering solutions. Brad's presentation to the board credited systematic analysis and manufacturing optimization for resolving the issues, with no mention of the specific technical insights that had made the solutions possible. This pattern of minimizing my contributions while taking credit for my solutions became the standard operating procedure for how Victoria and Brad managed technical challenges. My expertise was essential for solving complex problems, but my role in developing solutions was consistently understated or ignored entirely. I was being systematically erased from the innovation process while remaining indispensable for its technical execution. The contradiction was maddening, but it also revealed something important about Victoria's strategy. She needed my knowledge and capabilities to ensure GlucoWatch's commercial success, but she couldn't allow me to receive recognition for those contributions, because doing so would undermine the narrative she'd constructed about Brad's technical leadership and her own management effectiveness. The personal toll of this situation was becoming increasingly difficult to manage. I was working the same long hours I'd always worked, solving the same types of technical challenges I'd been handling for years, but receiving none of the recognition or professional satisfaction that had previously motivated me. My passion for improving diabetes management through innovative technology remained as strong as ever, but the joy of innovation was being systematically destroyed by organizational dynamics that reduced me to a technical resource rather than a creative contributor. I found myself dreading meetings where my work would be presented by others, avoiding company social events where I'd have to listen to Victoria and Brad discuss their technical achievements, and questioning whether continuing in this role was sustainable for my mental health and professional development. The situation became even more personally painful when my brother Carlos visited Austin to see the GlucoWatch technology that I'd been developing specifically to help people like him manage their diabetes more effectively. I'd been excited to show him the device and explain how it would eliminate the fingerstick testing that he'd been dealing with for over a decade. But when Carlos came to the office, Victoria insisted on conducting the demonstration herself, presenting GlucoWatch as a collaborative achievement of our technical team, with no specific mention of my role in developing the core innovations. Carlos knew enough about my work to understand what was happening, and afterward he pulled me aside to ask why I wasn't receiving credit for technology he knew I'd invented. "Maya, what's going on here?" he asked during dinner that evening. "That woman was talking about your invention like she developed it herself, and the guy she introduced as the technical lead obviously doesn't understand half of what you built. Why are you letting them do this to you?" I tried to explain the organizational changes and Victoria's rationale for restructuring technical leadership, but even as I said the words, I realized how weak and unconvincing they sounded. Carlos listened patiently, then asked the question I'd been avoiding. "What are you going to do about it?" I didn't have an answer, but his question forced me to confront the reality that my current situation was not only professionally unsustainable, but was also compromising the values and principles that had originally motivated me to pursue biomedical engineering. The final straw came when Victoria announced that GlucoWatch had received full FDA approval and would be launching commercially within 3 months. The press release she distributed to media outlets described the device as a revolutionary breakthrough in diabetes management, developed by Biotech Innovation's world-class technical team under the leadership of Chief Technology Officer Victoria Sterling, and lead technology officer Brad Chen. My name appeared nowhere in the announcement, despite the fact that every fundamental innovation that made GlucoWatch possible had originated from my research and development work. 4 years of my career, countless nights and weekends, breakthrough, technical achievements that would help millions of people, and I was completely absent from the story of how it all happened. That evening, I sat in my small apartment reviewing patent documents, employment contracts, and technical documentation that I'd accumulated over my 4 years at Biotech Innovations. As I read through my original patent applications, I realized that while Victoria had managed to add herself and Brad as co-inventors on several filings, the core spectroscopic analysis methods and machine learning algorithms were still primarily attributed to me. More importantly, I'd been careful to document my development process thoroughly, maintaining detailed lab notebooks and technical records that clearly established the timeline and authorship of every major innovation. If I ever needed to prove my role in developing GlucoWatch technology, I had comprehensive evidence to support my claims. But more significantly, I began to understand that my expertise in non-invasive glucose monitoring extended far beyond the specific implementation used in GlucoWatch. The fundamental scientific principles, the engineering approaches, and the technical insights I'd developed were broadly applicable to next-generation medical devices that could surpass GlucoWatch's capabilities in every meaningful way. Victoria and Brad might have control over the specific technology I'd developed at Biotech, but they couldn't control my knowledge, my creativity, or my ability to innovate in ways that would make their stolen technology look obsolete. For the first time since my demotion, I began to feel something other than frustration and disappointment. I felt possibility. Victoria Sterling had made a fundamental error in assuming that eliminating me from recognition and leadership would also eliminate me as a competitive threat. She'd focused so intently on taking credit for my past innovations that she'd completely failed to consider what I might create next. That oversight was about to become the most expensive mistake of her career, though she wouldn't realize it for several more months. The next morning, I did something I hadn't done since my demotion. I opened a new lab notebook and began sketching ideas for glucose monitoring technology that would make GlucoWatch look like a primitive prototype. If Victoria wanted to claim ownership of my previous work, that was fine. I was about to start building something that would make her stolen technology irrelevant. The question wasn't whether I could develop superior innovations. The question was whether I had the courage to bet my career on proving that my value extended far beyond any single invention or company. As I began outlining technical approaches that could improve accuracy, reduce costs, and expand functionality beyond anything currently possible, I realized that I was about to find out exactly what I was capable of accomplishing when properly motivated. The garage behind my rental house in East Austin became my sanctuary. For 28 years, I'd never owned so much as a screwdriver. But within 2 weeks of my decision to start over, I'd transformed the space into a functional research lab. I bought used optical benches from university surplus sales, assembled spectroscopy equipment from components I found on scientific equipment resale websites, and built testing stations using parts I ordered from electronics distributors across the country. Every evening after enduring another day of watching Brad present my work as his own achievements, I would drive home and disappear into this space where I could think clearly and work without anyone looking over my shoulder or questioning my technical decisions. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was essentially recreating the workspace I'd had during my first year at Biotech, when Jake and I were working out of a converted warehouse with equipment we'd assembled ourselves. But this time, I had 4 years of additional experience, a deep understanding of what worked and what didn't, and most importantly, complete creative freedom to pursue approaches that I'd always wanted to explore but couldn't justify within the constraints of commercial development timelines. I wasn't just trying to replicate GlucoWatch technology. I was building something fundamentally superior that would make every existing glucose monitoring system look obsolete by comparison. My initial breakthrough came from recognizing a limitation in the GlucoWatch design that I'd never been able to address during its development. The device could monitor glucose levels accurately, but it couldn't predict glucose trends with sufficient precision to prevent dangerous highs and lows before they occurred. Diabetics needed more than just current readings. They needed predictive analytics that could warn them about impending problems in time to take preventive action. The technical challenge was developing algorithms sophisticated enough to analyze multiple physiological indicators simultaneously and generate reliable predictions about glucose changes that would occur over the following 30 to 60 minutes. I began experimenting with multispectral analysis techniques that could monitor not just glucose, but also related metabolic indicators like lactate levels, ketone concentrations, and hydration status. By analyzing patterns across these multiple biomarkers, I could develop predictive models that would identify physiological changes associated with glucose fluctuations before those changes became apparent through traditional monitoring methods. The computational requirements were significant, but advances in mobile processing power and machine learning frameworks made it possible to perform sophisticated real-time analysis using hardware that could fit into a wearable device smaller than a typical smartwatch. The work was intellectually consuming in ways that reminded me why I'd originally fallen in love with biomedical engineering. Every evening, I would lose myself in problems that required combining optical physics, biochemistry, signal processing, and machine learning in ways that pushed the boundaries of what was technically feasible. I was designing custom optical sensors that could capture spectral data across broader wavelength ranges with higher resolution than anything I'd used in GlucoWatch. I was developing machine learning architectures that could process multiple data streams simultaneously and generate predictions with confidence intervals that would allow users to make informed decisions about their health management. But the most revolutionary aspect of what I was building wasn't just the technical capabilities. It was the approach to user experience and data integration that would transform how people thought about diabetes management. Instead of providing isolated glucose readings, my new system would offer comprehensive metabolic monitoring with personalized insights about how diet, exercise, stress, and medication affected individual users' physiological patterns. The device would learn each user's unique metabolic signature and provide customized recommendations for optimizing their health outcomes. It would integrate with fitness trackers, nutrition apps, and electronic health records to create a complete picture of how lifestyle factors influenced glucose control. The technical challenges were substantial, but they were exactly the kinds of problems I'd spent my entire career learning to solve. Developing optical sensors that could accurately measure multiple biomarkers simultaneously required precise control over light wavelengths, detector sensitivity, and signal processing algorithms. Creating machine learning models that could generate reliable predictions from complex physiological data required extensive training datasets and sophisticated validation procedures. Designing user interfaces that could present complex metabolic information in ways that were understandable and actionable required careful attention to human factors and usability principles. Working alone in my garage lab, I made progress faster than I'd ever achieved within the constraints of corporate development processes. Without having to justify every experimental approach through committee reviews or modify my technical decisions to accommodate marketing preferences, I could pursue optimal solutions rather than compromises. I didn't have to document every step for people who lacked the technical background to understand my work. I didn't have to present progress updates to managers who were more concerned with timeline adherence than breakthrough innovation. I could focus entirely on solving technical problems and pushing the boundaries of what was possible. The emotional satisfaction of this work was profound. For months, I'd been forced to watch other people take credit for innovations I'd developed, to see my technical expertise reduced to a support function, to endure meetings where my life's work was discussed as if I'd been a minor contributor rather than the primary inventor. But in my garage lab, surrounded by equipment I'd assembled myself and working on problems I'd chosen to pursue, I remembered what it felt like to be truly creative. Every successful experiment, every breakthrough insight, every elegant solution belonged entirely to me. No one could minimize my contributions or reframe my achievements to suit their professional agendas. I was also discovering that my technical capabilities had grown significantly during my years at biotech. The combination of deep experience with spectroscopic analysis, advanced understanding of machine learning applications, and practical knowledge of medical device development had made me far more capable than I'd been when I first developed GlucoWatch. Problems that had taken me weeks to solve 4 years earlier, I could now address in days. Technical approaches that had seemed impossibly complex during my early career were now within my capabilities. I was operating at a level of expertise that very few people in the world possessed, and for the first time in months, I was able to apply that expertise without external limitations or interference. The predictive glucose monitoring system I was developing represented advances in multiple technical domains simultaneously. The optical sensor design incorporated innovations that improved accuracy while reducing power consumption and manufacturing costs. The machine learning algorithms utilized approaches that enhanced prediction reliability while minimizing computational requirements. The user interface design integrated complex data presentation with intuitive interaction patterns that would make sophisticated metabolic monitoring accessible to people without technical backgrounds. Every component represented improvements over existing technologies, but the integrated system offered capabilities that no existing device could match. As my technical progress accelerated, I began considering the practical challenges of bringing this technology to market independently. Unlike my experience at biotech, where I'd been primarily focused on research and development, while other people handled business strategy and commercialization planning, I now needed to understand regulatory requirements, manufacturing processes, distribution strategies, and competitive positioning. I spent weekends researching FDA approval pathways for medical devices, studying patent landscapes to ensure my innovations were appropriately protected, and analyzing market opportunities for advanced glucose monitoring technologies. The business research revealed both challenges and opportunities that I hadn't fully appreciated during my employment at biotech. The medical device industry was highly regulated and required significant capital investments for clinical testing, regulatory approval, and manufacturing scale-up. But it was also experiencing rapid innovation driven by advances in sensor technology, data analytics, and mobile computing platforms. Companies that could successfully integrate these technological capabilities into user-friendly medical devices were achieving valuations that reflected the enormous market opportunity for improving chronic disease management. More importantly, I discovered that the competitive landscape for glucose monitoring was much broader than I'd realized while working within biotech's limited perspective. Major technology companies including Apple, Google, and Samsung were investing heavily in health monitoring capabilities for their consumer devices. Pharmaceutical companies were developing digital therapeutics that combined medical devices with software applications to provide comprehensive disease management solutions. Startup companies were pursuing novel approaches to non-invasive biomarker detection that could expand beyond glucose to monitor multiple health indicators simultaneously. This broader market context made me realize that the technology I was developing in my garage lab wasn't just an incremental improvement over GlucoWatch. It represented a potential platform for next-generation health monitoring that could address much larger market opportunities than single-purpose medical devices. The predictive analytics capabilities, multi-biomarker monitoring, and integrated health management features I was building could form the foundation for comprehensive metabolic health platforms that would appeal to consumers, healthcare providers, and technology companies looking to expand their health-focused product offerings. The realization that I was building something with such significant commercial potential was both exciting and daunting. I'd never considered myself an entrepreneur, preferring to focus on technical innovation while leaving business development to other people. But my experience at biotech had taught me that technical excellence alone wasn't sufficient to ensure that innovative technologies reached the people who could benefit from them. Victoria's systematic appropriation of my work had demonstrated how easily brilliant innovations could be controlled and commercialized by people who contributed nothing to their development, but possessed better understanding of corporate politics and business strategy. I began developing a comprehensive business plan that would allow me to maintain control over my innovations while building a sustainable company around them. The plan included strategies for intellectual property protection, clinical validation, regulatory approval, manufacturing partnerships, and market positioning that would differentiate my technology from existing glucose monitoring solutions. I researched potential investors who had experience with medical device companies and understood the unique challenges of bringing innovative health technologies to market. I identified potential strategic partners who could provide manufacturing capabilities, distribution channels, or complementary technologies that would accelerate commercialization. The intellectual property strategy was particularly important, given my experience with Victoria's manipulation of patent applications at biotech. I engaged a patent attorney who specialized in medical device innovations and had experience protecting inventors' rights in complex commercial situations. Together, we developed a comprehensive filing strategy that would establish clear ownership of my innovations while creating defensive barriers against potential challenges from biotech or other competitors. The attorney assured me that my detailed documentation of the development process, combined with the fundamental differences between my new technology and GlucoWatch, would provide strong protection for my intellectual property rights. But the most crucial element of my business planning was developing a timeline that would allow me to demonstrate the superiority of my technology before GlucoWatch achieved significant market penetration. Victoria was planning to launch GlucoWatch within 3 months, and I knew that establishing market position would provide biotech with significant advantages, even if superior technologies became available later. I needed to complete clinical validation, secure regulatory approval, and begin commercial production quickly enough to offer a clearly superior alternative while the glucose monitoring market was still in its early stages. The aggressive timeline required making strategic decisions about development priorities and resource allocation that would have been unnecessary if I'd had unlimited time and funding. I focused on perfecting the core predictive analytics capabilities that would provide the clearest differentiation from existing technologies, while simplifying other features that could be enhanced in later product generations. I identified clinical research organizations that could conduct validation studies efficiently, regulatory consultants who could expedite FDA approval processes, and manufacturing partners who had experience with rapid scale-up of complex medical devices. Working 18-hour days between my job at biotech and my garage lab research, I was pushing myself harder than I'd ever worked before. But unlike the exhaustion I'd felt during the final months at biotech, when my efforts were being systematically devalued and appropriated, this exhaustion felt purposeful and energizing. Every hour I invested was building something that belonged entirely to me, something that could transform how millions of people managed their health, something that would prove conclusively that my value extended far beyond any single invention or employer. The technical progress was remarkable. Within 6 months of beginning my garage lab research, I had functioning prototypes that demonstrated predictive accuracy rates exceeding 95% for glucose fluctuations occurring within 60-minute windows. The multi-biomarker monitoring capabilities were providing insights into metabolic patterns that no existing device could detect. The user interface was intuitive enough that people without medical training could understand and act on the information being provided. I was building technology that would make GlucoWatch look like a primitive first-generation device by comparison. But even more satisfying than the technical achievements was the growing confidence that I could succeed as an independent innovator and entrepreneur. The business skills I was developing, the strategic partnerships I was forming, and the commercial understanding I was gaining were proving that technical expertise could be successfully combined with business acumen when properly motivated. Victoria had assumed that eliminating me from recognition and leadership would also eliminate me as a competitive threat. She was about to discover just how wrong that assumption had been. The moment I knew I was ready to move forward came when I completed my first successful clinical trial simulation using volunteer subjects from the local diabetes support group that my brother had connected me with. The predictive analytics accurately identified glucose fluctuations an average of 47 minutes before they would have been detected using traditional monitoring methods. The early warning capabilities allowed test subjects to take preventive action that avoided dangerous glucose spikes and crashes entirely. Several participants told me that the technology would completely change how they managed their condition, providing them with confidence and control they'd never experienced before. That evening, I filed my first patent applications for the predictive glucose monitoring system, establishing priority for innovations that would form the foundation of my new company. The next morning, I submitted my resignation letter to Victoria Sterling, effective in 2 weeks. The letter was brief and professional, stating simply that I was pursuing other opportunities that better aligned with my career objectives. I didn't mention my garage lab research, my patent applications, or my plans to compete directly with GlucoWatch using technology that would make it obsolete. Victoria would discover all of that soon enough, and when she did, she would finally understand the true cost of systematically underestimating someone whose only mistake had been trusting that merit would be recognized and rewarded appropriately. Victoria's reaction to my resignation was everything I'd expected and more. She called me into her office within an hour of receiving my letter, her carefully composed corporate demeanor cracking just enough to reveal the panic underneath. "Maya, this is incredibly sudden," she began, gesturing for me to sit in the chair across from her imposing mahogany desk. "I have to say, I'm quite surprised by your decision to leave, especially given how well the GlucoWatch launch is progressing. Can you help me understand what's driving this choice?" Her voice carried that practiced tone of concerned leadership, but her eyes were calculating, already trying to assess what kind of threat my departure might represent to her carefully constructed narrative about technical leadership and innovation management. I kept my response deliberately vague and professional. "I've been offered an opportunity that aligns better with my long-term career goals," I said, maintaining eye contact while revealing nothing about the nature of that opportunity. "I'm grateful for my time at biotech and wish everyone continued success with GlucoWatch commercialization." Victoria leaned forward slightly, her executive training kicking in as she tried to extract more information through seemingly casual conversation. "Maya, I hope you know how much we value your contributions here. If this is about compensation or role responsibilities, those are certainly things we could discuss. The company is entering an exciting growth phase, and there will be tremendous opportunities for career advancement as we expand our product portfolio." The offer was almost laughable. After systematically stripping away my recognition, authority, and creative freedom, Victoria was now suggesting that money or a slightly better title might convince me to stay and continue being her technical resource. "I appreciate that," I replied, "but I've already committed to my next opportunity. I'm happy to ensure a smooth transition during my remaining time here." Victoria's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. She was accustomed to controlling situations through a combination of corporate authority and strategic manipulation. But my polite deflection was providing her with no leverage to influence my decision. The 2 weeks that followed were fascinating to observe from an anthropological perspective. Victoria assigned Brad to conduct exit interviews with me, ostensibly to capture institutional knowledge that might be valuable for ongoing development. Work. In reality, these sessions were intelligence-gathering missions designed to determine whether I posed any competitive threat to biotech's market position. Brad would ask seemingly casual questions about my future plans, whether I intended to remain in the medical device industry, and if I had any ongoing relationships with companies that might be developing glucose monitoring technologies. I answered every question truthfully while revealing nothing of strategic importance. Yes, I planned to continue working in biomedical engineering because it was my area of expertise and passion. No, I hadn't signed with any existing medical device companies. which was technically accurate since I was starting my own company rather than joining an established organization. Yes, I would be working on projects related to health monitoring, which was sufficiently broad to encompass virtually any biomedical engineering work. Brad took detailed notes during these conversations, clearly reporting back to Victoria about my responses and trying to assess the likelihood that I might become a competitive threat. The most revealing moment came during my final week, when Victoria requested a private meeting to discuss ongoing intellectual property considerations. She had clearly been consulting with biotech's legal team about potential risks associated with my departure. "Maya, I want to make sure we're both clear about the intellectual property agreements in your employment contract," she began, sliding a thick folder of documents across her desk. "All innovations developed during your time at biotech remain the property of the company, and your non-compete agreement prevents you from working on similar technologies for 18 months after your departure." I had anticipated this conversation and had already reviewed my contracts thoroughly with my patent attorney. "I understand my obligations completely," I responded calmly. "I have no intention of violating any agreements I've signed with biotech." Victoria seemed somewhat reassured by this response, but I could see her calculating whether my answer provided sufficient protection for the company's interests. "I'm glad to hear that," she said. "Of course, if you ever have questions about whether a particular project might conflict with your agreements, please don't hesitate to reach out. We want to ensure that everyone's interests are properly protected." The conversation revealed just how paranoid Victoria had become about potential competition, and how little she understood about the scope of my technical capabilities. She was focused on preventing me from replicating GlucoWatch technology, apparently unaware that I could develop superior innovations that would make GlucoWatch obsolete without violating any of my existing agreements. Her legal strategy was designed to protect against copying, not against breakthrough innovation that would leapfrog their technology entirely. My last day at biotech was anticlimactic. I cleared out my small office, said goodbye to colleagues, who seemed genuinely sorry to see me leave, and submitted my final status reports on projects I'd been supporting. Victoria was notably absent from the office that day, apparently attending meetings with investors about GlucoWatch's commercial launch timeline. Brad shook my hand and wished me luck, still fishing for information about my future plans right up until the moment I walked out the door. I drove home that evening feeling a sense of liberation that I hadn't experienced in months. The following Monday morning, I was no longer Maya Rodriguez, Senior Research Associate at Biotech Innovations. I was Maya Rodriguez, founder and CEO of Metabolic Dynamics, a medical device company that was about to revolutionize glucose monitoring and diabetes management. The business plan I'd developed during my garage lab months was now my roadmap for building a company that would prove definitively that innovation comes from vision and expertise, not from corporate politics and credit theft. My first major decision was relocating my operations from my garage to a proper laboratory and office space. I found a perfect facility in a technology incubator near the University of Texas campus, a space that provided not only modern laboratory equipment, but also access to graduate students, research collaborations, and a community of entrepreneurs who understood the challenges of building science-based companies. The contrast with my garage workshop was dramatic, but more importantly, the professional environment sent a clear message to potential investors, partners, and employees that Metabolic Dynamics was a serious enterprise with serious ambitions. The clinical validation process moved forward with remarkable speed. My patent attorney had connected me with Dr. Amanda Kim, a leading endocrinologist at Dell Medical School, who specialized in diabetes technology research. Dr. Kim was immediately fascinated by the predictive analytics capabilities I'd developed and agreed to collaborate on clinical trials that would validate the technology's effectiveness for diabetes management. "Maya, what you've built here represents a fundamental advance in how we think about glucose monitoring," she told me during our first meeting. Current technologies tell patients what their glucose levels were 15 minutes ago. Your system tells them what their glucose levels will be 30 minutes from now. That's the difference between reactive and proactive diabetes management. The clinical trials exceeded even my most optimistic projections. Patients using my predictive glucose monitoring system experienced 73% fewer dangerous glucose episodes compared to those using traditional monitoring methods, including GlucoWatch. The early warning capabilities allowed users to take preventive action that avoided health crises entirely, rather than simply responding to problems after they occurred. Patient satisfaction scores were extraordinary, with 94% of trial participants reporting that the technology fundamentally changed their relationship with diabetes management. They felt empowered rather than controlled by their condition. But the most compelling validation came from the trial participants themselves. Maria Santos, a 38-year-old teacher who had been managing type 1 diabetes for 15 years, told me that my device had given her confidence to pursue activities she'd avoided for years because of unpredictable glucose fluctuations. I can coach my daughter's soccer team now because I know exactly when my glucose might drop and can prevent it before it happens, she explained. I'm not constantly worried about emergencies anymore. I'm actually living my life instead of just managing my disease. These personal stories reinforced my conviction that the technology I'd developed represented more than just an incremental improvement in medical devices. It was a transformative tool that could restore quality of life for millions of people who had been limited by the unpredictability of their chronic condition. Every testimonial from trial participants reminded me why I'd originally chosen biomedical engineering as my career path, and validated my decision to pursue independent innovation rather than accepting Victoria's systematic devaluation of my capabilities. The business development progress was equally encouraging. Within 6 months of founding Metabolic Dynamics, I had secured initial funding from Texas-based venture capital firms that specialized in healthcare technology investments. The investors were impressed not only by the clinical trial results, but also by the comprehensive business strategy I'd developed and the experienced team I was assembling. My patent attorney had introduced me to operations executives with medical device industry experience, and Dr. Kim had connected me with regulatory consultants who could expedite FDA approval processes. The intellectual property portfolio I was building provided strong competitive protection for my innovations. The patent applications I'd filed covered not just the predictive analytics algorithms, but also the multi-biomarker sensing technologies, the user interface designs, and the data integration approaches that made comprehensive metabolic monitoring possible. My attorney assured me that these patents would create substantial barriers for competitors trying to replicate my technology, while providing licensing opportunities that could generate additional revenue streams. Meanwhile, Biotech's GlucoWatch launch was proceeding exactly as I'd expected. The device received positive initial reviews from healthcare providers and patients who appreciated its non-invasive glucose monitoring capabilities. Sales were strong during the first quarter, and Victoria was receiving recognition from industry publications for her role in bringing innovative diabetes technology to market. But the limitations of GlucoWatch's reactive monitoring approach were already becoming apparent to users who wanted more comprehensive diabetes management solutions. The competitive comparison became inevitable when medical technology journalists began reviewing both GlucoWatch and the early reports about Metabolic Dynamics' predictive monitoring system. The differences were stark and undeniable. GlucoWatch provided accurate glucose readings but required users to interpret that data and make their own decisions about diet, exercise, and medication timing. My system provided predictive analytics that enabled proactive health management while offering personalized recommendations based on each user's unique metabolic patterns and lifestyle factors. Dr. Sarah Chen, a prominent diabetes researcher at Stanford who had no connection to either company, published a comparative analysis in the Journal of Diabetes Technology that captured the fundamental distinction perfectly. While current glucose monitoring Technologies tell patients what is happening to their glucose levels. Predictive analytics systems tell patients what will happen to their glucose levels. This shift from reactive to proactive monitoring represents the most significant advance in diabetes management technology in over a decade. The market response was immediate and decisive. Healthcare providers began expressing interest in prescribing predictive monitoring systems for patients who needed more sophisticated glucose management tools. Insurance companies conducted cost-benefit analyses that demonstrated the potential for significant healthcare savings through prevention of diabetes-related emergencies and hospitalizations. Technology companies started exploring partnerships that would integrate predictive health monitoring into consumer devices and wellness platforms. Victoria's reaction to this competitive pressure was predictable and ultimately self-destructive. Rather than acknowledging the technological superiority of predictive monitoring and pivoting biotech's development strategy accordingly, she doubled down on marketing GlucoWatch as a premium medical device while attacking my credibility through industry connections and trade publications. Her public relations campaign emphasized her pharmaceutical industry experience and Brad's technical leadership, while questioning whether a small startup could deliver on promises about revolutionary diabetes technology. The strategy backfired spectacularly. Industry observers recognized that Victoria's attacks on metabolic dynamics were motivated by competitive desperation rather than legitimate technical concerns. Her attempts to minimize my role in developing glucose monitoring technology were contradicted by patent records and clinical trial results that clearly established my innovation's superiority. Most importantly, her focus on attacking competitors distracted from biotech's own product development efforts at exactly the moment when rapid innovation was essential for maintaining market relevance. The turning point came when TechCorp Solutions, one of the largest medical device companies in the world, approached me about acquiring Metabolic Dynamics. Lisa Park, TechCorp's CEO, had been following my company's progress since our clinical trial results were published and was impressed by both the technology and the business strategy I'd executed. "Maya, what you've built represents the future of personalized healthcare," she told me during our first meeting. TechCorp has the manufacturing capabilities, distribution channels, and global reach to bring predictive health monitoring to hundreds of millions of people worldwide. We'd like to discuss how we can support that vision. The acquisition negotiations were complex, but ultimately successful. TechCorp's offer valued Metabolic Dynamics at $847 million, a figure that reflected both the proven technology and the enormous market opportunity for predictive health monitoring. More importantly, the terms of the acquisition ensured that I would lead TechCorp's new predictive health division with complete authority over technology development, clinical research, and product strategy. I would finally have the resources and platform necessary to scale my innovations globally while maintaining the creative freedom that had made those innovations possible. The announcement of TechCorp's acquisition of Metabolic Dynamics sent shockwaves through the medical device industry. Stock analysts immediately recognized that predictive health monitoring represented a paradigm shift that would affect every company developing diabetes management technologies. Biotech's stock price dropped 31% within a week as investors realized that GlucoWatch would become obsolete once TechCorp's predictive monitoring systems reached the market. Victoria's response revealed the desperation that had been building since my departure. She called me directly, bypassing professional channels, and attempting to appeal to our former working relationship. "Maya, I think there's been a misunderstanding about your departure from biotech," she began, her voice carrying none of the corporate authority that had once intimidated me. "I've been thinking about how we might collaborate between our companies, perhaps licensing some of your innovations for integration into GlucoWatch technology." The conversation was surreal. The woman who had systematically appropriated my work, stolen my recognition, and reduced me to a technical support role was now trying to negotiate access to the superior technology I'd developed independently. "Victoria, I appreciate your call," I replied. But TechCorp's technology strategy doesn't include partnerships with competing glucose monitoring companies. We're focused on developing next-generation solutions rather than enhancing existing devices. Her desperation became more apparent as the conversation continued. Maya, surely you understand that biotech's established market position and regulatory relationships could be valuable for accelerating adoption of predictive monitoring technology. There might be opportunities for both companies to benefit from collaboration rather than competition. I almost felt sorry for her. She was grasping for any strategy that might allow biotech to survive the technological disruption that was about to make their primary product irrelevant. Victoria, I wish you and everyone at biotech continued success, I said, maintaining the same polite professionalism I'd used during my resignation. But Metabolic Dynamics was built specifically to develop technologies that existing companies couldn't or wouldn't pursue. Collaboration wasn't really an option once you decided that my innovations were better managed by other people. The silence that followed was telling. Victoria finally understood that her systematic undermining of my contributions had consequences that extended far beyond workplace politics or recognition disputes. She had created a competitor whose technological capabilities and market resources made biotech's survival questionable. Her attempts to control my work had ultimately led to losing any chance of benefiting from my innovations. 6 months after the TechCorp acquisition, I stood on stage at the International Diabetes Technology Conference, delivering the keynote presentation about the future of predictive health monitoring. The audience included thousands of healthcare providers, researchers, and industry executives who were eager to understand how artificial intelligence and advanced analytics would transform chronic disease management. In the front row, I could see Dr. Kim, my clinical collaborator, and Lisa Park, who had become both my business partner and mentor in navigating the complexities of global healthcare markets. During the presentation, I demonstrated the latest generation of predictive monitoring technology that TechCorp was preparing to launch worldwide. The device was smaller, more accurate, and more comprehensive than anything I could have imagined. During my early days at biotech, it monitored not just glucose but multiple biomarkers associated with metabolic health, providing users with personalized insights about nutrition, exercise, stress management, and medication optimization. The technology represented the culmination of everything I'd learned about biomedical engineering, machine learning, and user experience design. But the most satisfying moment came during the question and answer session when a healthcare provider asked about the origins of predictive monitoring technology. Dr. Rodriguez, can you tell us about the inspiration for developing these revolutionary diabetes management tools? I looked out at the audience, thinking about the journey that had brought me to this point, the obstacles I'd overcome, and the people whose lives would be improved by technology that had emerged from my garage laboratory. The inspiration came from recognizing that people with chronic conditions deserve better than reactive healthcare, I replied. They deserve tools that help them stay healthy rather than just managing problems after they occur. Sometimes the most important innovations come from being willing to start over when existing systems aren't meeting people's real needs. After the presentation, I was approached by dozens of researchers, entrepreneurs, and healthcare providers who wanted to discuss collaboration opportunities, licensing agreements, and research partnerships. The technology I'd developed in isolation was now the foundation for a global platform that would influence how millions of people manage their health. The recognition was gratifying, but more important was knowing that my work would genuinely improve lives in ways that went far beyond what any individual company or product could achieve. That evening, I received a text message from my brother Carlos, who had been following my company's progress since my garage lab days. Maya, I just saw your presentation online. I can't believe my little sister is changing the world. When do I get to try the new device? I smiled, remembering how his questions about my career at biotech had helped me recognize that I deserved better than the role Victoria had tried to confine me to. His support during my most difficult professional period had been invaluable, and his pride in my success meant more than any industry recognition. The final validation came from an unexpected source. Jake Morrison, Biotech's original founder, requested a meeting during the conference. We met at a quiet coffee shop near the convention center, far from the crowds of industry professionals and media representatives. Jake looked older and more tired than I remembered, and I could see the weight of watching his company struggle against superior competition. "Maya, I owe you an apology," he began, meeting my eyes directly for the first time since my demotion. "I should have fought harder to protect your role at Biotech. I let the board and Victoria convince me that organizational changes were necessary for commercial success. But I knew those changes were wrong. You were the heart of our innovation capability, and losing you was the biggest mistake I've ever made as a founder." I appreciated his honesty and regretted that our professional relationship had ended so poorly. "Jake, I understand the pressures you were facing," I replied. "Building a company requires balancing multiple stakeholder interests, and sometimes those decisions don't work out the way anyone intended." We talked for over an hour about the early days at Biotech, the excitement of developing breakthrough technology, and the challenges of maintaining innovation culture as companies grow and institutionalize. As we prepared to leave, Jake asked the question I'd been expecting. "Maya, what happens to Biotech now?" "Gluco watch sales are declining as healthcare providers wait for TechCorp's predictive monitoring systems. Our investors are pressuring us to pivot or consider acquisition offers, but Victoria insists we can compete through marketing and partnerships." I felt sympathy for Jake's situation, but I also knew that Biotech's struggles were the natural consequence of prioritizing corporate politics over innovation excellence. "Jake, the medical device industry rewards companies that solve real problems for patients and healthcare providers," I said. "GlucoWatch was an important step forward, but predictive monitoring addresses needs that reactive technologies simply can't meet. The market will decide which approach provides more value." 3 months later, Biotech announced that it was ceasing GlucoWatch production and liquidating its assets to return capital to investors. Victoria left the company immediately after the announcement, and Brad accepted a position with a traditional medical device manufacturer that specialized in established technologies rather than breakthrough innovations. Jake used his proceeds from the liquidation to start a new company focused on medical device manufacturing rather than research and development. Today, TechCorp's predictive health monitoring platform is used by over 12 million people worldwide, with expansion plans that will bring the technology to developing markets where diabetes prevalence is rising rapidly. The technology has evolved far beyond glucose monitoring to include comprehensive metabolic health management, personalized nutrition recommendations, and integration with electronic health records that enable collaborative care between patients and healthcare providers. But the achievement I'm most proud of isn't the commercial success or industry recognition. It's the thousands of letters and emails I receive from people whose lives have been transformed by having predictive control over their health. Parents who can manage their children's diabetes without constant anxiety. Athletes who can optimize their performance while maintaining metabolic health. Elderly patients who can age independently because they have early warning systems for health changes that might otherwise lead to emergencies. Victoria Sterling, if you're watching this, I want you to know that I'm genuinely grateful for the experience at Biotech, even though it didn't end the way either of us intended. Your systematic efforts to minimize my contributions and control my work taught me valuable lessons about the importance of maintaining ownership over my innovations and building organizations that support rather than exploit creative talent. Without that education, I might never have developed the determination necessary to prove that breakthrough innovation comes from vision and persistence, not from corporate manipulation and credit theft. Sometimes being demoted to janitor is exactly the motivation you need to build something that makes your former employer's technology look obsolete. Sometimes the best revenge is simply becoming impossible to ignore, impossible to diminish, and impossible to control. Sometimes the Greatest victory isn't proving that you were right, but proving that you were capable of much more than anyone ever imagined. The message arrived on a Tuesday morning while I was reviewing quarterly reports from TechCorp's international divisions. My assistant knocked on my office door, holding a thick envelope marked with the official seal of the Patent and Trademark Office. Inside was a letter notifying me that my original patents for predictive glucose monitoring had been inducted into the National Inventors Hall of Fame, recognizing innovations that have fundamentally transformed human health and quality of life. The honor placed my work alongside breakthrough technologies like insulin therapy, magnetic resonance imaging, and the artificial heart. It was validation that the technology I'd developed in my garage laboratory had achieved the kind of lasting impact that defines entire generations of medical advancement. Reading that letter, I thought about the journey from that humiliating morning when my security badge stopped working at biotech to this moment of recognition from the highest levels of scientific achievement. The patents being honored weren't the ones that Victoria had manipulated to include herself and Brad as co-inventors. These were the foundational innovations I'd filed independently, the breakthrough algorithms and sensor designs that had emerged from months of 18-hour days in my makeshift laboratory. The Patent Office had conducted extensive historical analysis to verify the origins and development timeline of predictive monitoring technology, and their conclusions left no ambiguity about who had conceived and developed the core innovations that revolutionized diabetes management. The timing of this recognition was particularly meaningful because it coincided with the 5th anniversary of TechCorp's acquisition of Metabolic Dynamics. 5 years during which the technology platform I'd built had expanded far beyond glucose monitoring to become the foundation for comprehensive personalized health management. The latest generation of devices could predict not just blood sugar fluctuations, but cardiovascular events, respiratory complications, and neurological changes that preceded serious medical episodes. What had started as a solution for diabetes management had evolved into a platform for proactive healthcare that was transforming how people understood and managed their long-term health outcomes. The expansion into broader health monitoring had required developing partnerships with research institutions, pharmaceutical companies, and healthcare systems around the world. My role as Chief Innovation Officer at TechCorp had evolved to include overseeing research collaborations with universities in 17 countries, managing clinical trials involving over 200,000 participants, and guiding technology development that integrated insights from genomics, environmental science, and behavioral psychology. The scope of work was far beyond anything I could have imagined during my early career at biotech, but it represented the natural evolution of predictive health technology toward comprehensive personalized medicine. One of the most rewarding aspects of this expansion was working with researchers who were applying predictive analytics to health challenges I'd never considered. Dr. Jennifer Walsh at Massachusetts General Hospital was using modified versions of my algorithms to predict seizures in epileptic patients, providing early warnings that allowed preventive medication administration. Dr. Michael Chen at the University of California was adapting the technology for predicting cardiac events in patients with heart disease, enabling interventions that prevented heart attacks and strokes. Dr. Sarah Kim at Johns Hopkins was developing applications for predicting complications in cancer patients undergoing chemotherapy, allowing personalized treatment adjustments that improved outcomes while reducing side effects. Each of these applications required fundamental advances in sensor technology, machine learning algorithms, and data integration approaches that pushed the boundaries of what was technically feasible. But they also represented the fulfillment of my original vision for biomedical engineering, using advanced technology to improve human health outcomes through prediction and prevention rather than reaction and treatment. The technology platform that had emerged from my frustration with Victoria's systematic appropriation of my work was now enabling breakthrough research that would benefit millions of people worldwide. The commercial success had been extraordinary as well. TechCorp's Predictive Health Division, which I continued to lead, had generated over $4 billion in revenue during the 5 years since the acquisition. The technology was licensed to device manufacturers, pharmaceutical companies, and healthcare systems in 63 countries. Consumer versions integrated into smartphones and wearable devices were being used by over 50 million people for daily health monitoring and optimization. The economic impact extended far beyond direct sales to include healthcare cost savings, estimated at over $12 billion annually through prevention of medical emergencies and optimization of treatment protocols. But the metrics that mattered most to me weren't financial or commercial. They were the human impact statistics that arrived in quarterly reports from healthcare systems around the world. Emergency department visits for diabetes-related complications had decreased by 67% among patients using predictive monitoring systems. Hospital readmissions for cardiovascular events had dropped by 54% in healthcare networks that implemented comprehensive predictive health protocols. Most importantly, patient satisfaction and quality of life measures showed consistent improvements across all demographic groups and geographic regions where the technology had been deployed. The personal stories continued to arrive daily through emails, letters, and social media messages from people whose lives had been transformed by having predictive control over their health. Maria Santos, the teacher who had participated in my original clinical trials, sent me annual updates about her daughter's soccer achievements and her own career advancement to become a school principal. She credited the confidence that came from reliable health management with enabling her to pursue leadership opportunities she'd previously avoided. Maya, knowing that I can predict and prevent glucose problems, has given me the freedom to focus on goals and dreams instead of constantly managing medical emergencies, she wrote in her latest message. These personal connections reminded me why I'd originally chosen biomedical engineering as my career path, and reinforced my commitment to ensuring that breakthrough technologies reached the people who could benefit from them most. During my monthly visits to diabetes support groups in Austin, I would meet with patients who were using the latest generation of predictive monitoring devices and hear firsthand how the technology was affecting their daily lives. The conversations weren't about technical specifications or commercial success metrics. They were about parents who could sleep through the night without worrying about their children's glucose levels, athletes who could compete confidently without fear of dangerous blood sugar crashes, and elderly patients who could maintain independent living because they had early warning systems for health changes. The international recognition had also created opportunities to influence healthcare policy and technology development standards at the highest levels of government and industry organizations. I served on advisory committees for the Food and Drug Administration, the World Health Organization, and the International Standards Organization, helping to establish regulatory frameworks and technical standards that would ensure the safety and effectiveness of predictive health technologies as they became more widely adopted. The experience had taught me that breakthrough innovations require not just technical excellence, but also thoughtful consideration of ethical implications, privacy protections, and equitable access across different economic and social circumstances. One of the most significant policy initiatives I'd championed was ensuring that predictive health technologies would be available to underserved populations who often had the greatest need for advanced medical management tools. Working with international development organizations and healthcare foundations, we'd established programs that provided subsidized access to predictive monitoring devices in developing countries where diabetes prevalence was rising rapidly, but healthcare infrastructure remained limited. The programs had demonstrated that predictive health technology could be successfully adapted for different cultural contexts and resource constraints, while maintaining effectiveness and user satisfaction. The educational impact had been equally important. I'd established research fellowships and scholarship programs that supported students from underrepresented backgrounds in pursuing biomedical engineering careers, focused on health equity and accessibility. The programs partnered with universities across the United States and internationally to provide mentorship, research opportunities, and professional development that would prepare the next generation of innovators to address global health challenges. Many of the fellowship recipients were now leading their own research projects and startup companies, creating a multiplier effect that extended the impact of predictive health technology far beyond my individual contributions. Victoria Sterling's career had followed a very different trajectory during these 5 years. After biotech's liquidation, she'd struggled to find comparable executive positions within the medical device industry. Her association with GlucoWatch's commercial failure and her public disputes with former employees had created reputation challenges that limited her opportunities with established companies. She'd eventually accepted a consulting position with a pharmaceutical industry trade association, focusing on regulatory compliance and policy analysis rather than technology development or innovation management. The role was professionally respectable, but lacked the authority and recognition she'd sought during her time at biotech. I occasionally encountered Victoria at industry conferences and professional events, where our interactions were politely cordial but clearly uncomfortable for both of us. She would congratulate me on TechCorp's success and ask general questions about the evolution of predictive health technology. But there was always an underlying tension that reflected our shared understanding of how differently things might have developed if she'd chosen to support rather than appropriate my innovations. I felt no satisfaction in her professional struggles, but I also recognized that her experience illustrated the long-term consequences of prioritizing short-term political advantage over sustainable innovation excellence. Brad Chen had found more success in his post-biotech career, accepting a senior engineering position with the established medical device manufacturer that focused on incremental improvements to existing technologies rather than breakthrough innovations. His background in manufacturing and regulatory compliance had proved valuable for companies that prioritized operational excellence over revolutionary research and development. We'd maintained a professional relationship and occasionally collaborated on industry standards committees where his practical experience complemented my focus on advanced technology development. Brad had been more gracious about acknowledging my role in developing the foundational technologies we'd worked on together, and I respected his honesty about the limitations of his contributions during the GlucoWatch development period. Jake Morrison had achieved moderate success with his new company, which specialized in contract manufacturing for medical device startups and small companies that needed production capabilities without the overhead of establishing their own facilities. His experience building biotech from a garage startup to a venture-funded company had provided valuable insights for entrepreneurs who were navigating similar challenges. We'd renewed our friendship over the years, and Jake had become an informal advisor for some of the research fellows and scholarship recipients I mentored. His perspective on the business challenges of scaling innovative technologies was valuable for young entrepreneurs who had brilliant technical ideas but limited experience with commercial development. The relationship with Jake had also provided opportunities for reflection on the organizational dynamics that had led to my departure from biotech and the eventual development of superior competing technology. During our occasional coffee meetings, we would discuss how companies could maintain innovation culture while meeting the operational requirements that came with growth and institutional investment. Jake's experience with Victoria's leadership style had taught him valuable lessons about the importance of protecting creative talent and ensuring that recognition systems aligned with actual contributions rather than corporate hierarchies. These conversations had influenced my approach to leadership within TechCorp's predictive health division, where I'd implemented policies and procedures designed to prevent the kind of credit appropriation and talent devaluation that had characterized my final months at biotech. Every researcher and engineer in the division maintained detailed documentation of their individual contributions to collaborative projects. Patent applications always listed inventors in order of actual contribution rather than organizational hierarchy. Performance evaluations and promotion decisions were based on technical achievements and innovation impact rather than corporate networking or presentation skills. The division had become known throughout TechCorp and the broader industry as an exceptional place for talented researchers and engineers to pursue breakthrough innovations while maintaining ownership and recognition for their work. Our voluntary employee turnover rate was less than 3% annually, compared to industry averages exceeding 15%. More importantly, the division consistently produced innovations that generated both commercial success and meaningful health impact, demonstrating that protecting and supporting creative talent produced superior business results as well as ethical organizational practices. The success of these leadership approaches had created opportunities to share insights about innovation management with other companies and research institutions. I frequently spoke at conferences about building organizational cultures that supported breakthrough innovation while maintaining appropriate intellectual property protections and commercial viability. The presentations drew large audiences of executives, researchers, and entrepreneurs who were interested in understanding how technical excellence could be successfully combined with business strategy and ethical leadership practices. One of the most memorable speaking opportunities had been a keynote presentation at the annual conference of the Society for Women Engineers, where I addressed an audience of over 3,000 women who were pursuing careers in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. The presentation focused on the importance of maintaining confidence in your technical capabilities, even when others attempt to minimize or appropriate your contributions. I shared specific strategies for documenting innovations, protecting intellectual property, and building support networks that could provide guidance and advocacy during difficult professional situations. The response to that presentation had been overwhelming, with hundreds of attendees sharing their own experiences with workplace dynamics that had challenged their professional development and career advancement. Many described situations where their technical contributions had been minimized or credited to colleagues with more institutional authority, where their ideas had been implemented without appropriate recognition, or where they'd been excluded from leadership opportunities, despite having superior technical qualifications. The conversations reinforced my understanding that my experience at biotech wasn't unique, but reflected broader patterns within technology industries that needed systemic attention and correction. Following that conference, I'd established a mentorship program specifically designed to support women and underrepresented minorities who were pursuing careers in biomedical engineering and health technology development. The program provided technical guidance, professional development support, and networking opportunities that helped participants navigate career challenges while maintaining focus on innovation excellence. Many program alumni had gone on to leadership positions within established companies or had founded their own startups focused on addressing health challenges through advanced technology solutions. The mentorship work had been personally fulfilling in ways that complemented the satisfactions of technical achievement and commercial success. Working with early career engineers and researchers reminded me of my own passion for solving problems that could improve human health outcomes, and their enthusiasm and creativity inspired new approaches to challenges I'd been working on for years. Several breakthrough innovations in our latest generation of predictive health devices had emerged from collaborations with mentorship program participants who brought fresh perspectives and novel technical approaches to established research problems. Looking back on the entire journey from my early days at biotech to my current role leading predictive health innovation at TechCorp, I could see how every challenge and setback had contributed to developing the technical expertise, business, acumen, and leadership capabilities that were now enabling global impact on human health outcomes. Victoria's systematic appropriation of my work had been professionally devastating at the time, but it had also motivated me to prove that my value extended far beyond any single invention or company. The experience had taught me essential lessons about protecting intellectual property, building supportive professional relationships, and maintaining ownership over innovative work that had proved invaluable throughout my subsequent career. The recognition from the National Inventors Hall of Fame represented not just acknowledgement of specific technical achievements, but validation of an approach to innovation that prioritized human benefit over corporate politics or personal advancement. The patents being honored had emerged from months of isolated work in my garage laboratory, driven by determination to prove that breakthrough innovations could transform millions of lives regardless of the institutional obstacles or professional setbacks that might impede their development. As I prepared for the induction ceremony, where I would join the ranks of innovators whose work had fundamentally advanced human knowledge and capability, I thought about the message I wanted to share with the audience of researchers, entrepreneurs, and students who would be attending. The story wasn't really about revenge against people who had failed to recognize my value or commercial success that had exceeded my critics' expectations. It was about the importance of maintaining confidence in your capabilities even when others attempt to diminish them, the value of persistence when pursuing innovations that could benefit others, and the satisfaction that comes from building something meaningful regardless of the obstacles you encounter along the way. The technology that had started as a solution for my brother's diabetes management challenges had evolved into a platform that was improving health outcomes for tens of millions of people worldwide. The garage laboratory that had been my refuge during the most difficult period of my career had become the foundation for research facilities that were advancing the frontiers of personalized medicine and predictive healthcare. The determination to prove my worth that had sustained me through months of 18-hour days had developed into leadership capabilities that were now supporting hundreds of researchers and engineers who were pursuing their own breakthrough innovations. Victoria Sterling had taught me valuable lessons about the importance of maintaining ownership over my work and building organizations that supported, rather than exploited, creative talent. Her systematic efforts to appropriate my contributions had motivated me to develop business skills and entrepreneurial capabilities that enabled independent innovation and commercial success. Most importantly, her failure to recognize my potential had demonstrated that external validation, while personally satisfying, was less important than internal confidence in my ability to solve meaningful problems and create technologies that could improve human lives. The final lesson from this entire experience was that breakthrough innovation emerges from vision, persistence, and technical excellence rather than corporate positioning or political maneuvering. The predictive health technologies that were now transforming medical care worldwide had originated from a willingness to start over when existing systems weren't meeting people's real needs, to work in isolation when collaboration wasn't possible, and to maintain focus on human benefit, even when personal recognition seemed unlikely. Standing in my office that Tuesday morning, holding the letter from the Patent and Trademark Office, I felt profound gratitude for the journey that had brought me to this point. The challenges I'd overcome, the innovations I'd developed, and the impact I'd achieved represented more than professional success. They demonstrated that technical expertise combined with determination and ethical leadership could create lasting change that would benefit future generations, long after individual careers and corporate structures had evolved beyond recognition. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.